Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Mark Kennedy, Director of the Wahba Institute for Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center. We call it WISC, and WISC is focused on shaping conversations and inspiring meaningful action to strengthen our technology, trade, infrastructure, and energy as part of American economic and global leadership that benefits the nation and the world. We're thrilled to be hosting Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and honored that Congressman Amy Barra will be with us to provide concluding remarks. In advance of Secretary's conversation with our chairman, Sadek Wahba, we've got a rock star panel here to talk about the supply chain aspects of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that Secretary Raimondo is leading. With me here today, I have Sarah Kemp, Vice President of International Government Affairs for Intel, and formerly Deputy Undersecretary of International Trade Administration in the U.S. Department of Commerce. Dr. Phil Levy, Chief Economist of Flexport, previously having served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors and as a member of the policy planning staff at the Department of State. And Ryan Modlin, Head of U.S. External Affairs for Rio Tinto and a 20-year veteran of policy roles at a major trade association and at Fortune 500 manufacturing and mining companies. We'll dive right into it. Phil, let's start with you. The IPEF supply chain accord, for which negotiations have concluded, is said to be a world first where data will play an important role in responding to supply chain crises. Such a data-driven approach, though, relies on companies being willing to share proprietary information with competitors. How can data play an important role in resilient supply chains, and how can we get corporations to buy into this effort?
Yeah, it's a great question because everybody loves data, right? It's modern, it's information. What is possibly not to like? So I thought I'd start out with a couple of cautions, a few cautions, and then build to this. First, your point about how do you get corporations to buy in is exactly it. Because data doesn't just generate and distribute itself. That you need to have somebody invest in how do I pull the stuff together, how do I make it easily accessible, how to use. So whatever solution we come up with, we definitely want to make sure that it's incentive compatible, that the companies still want to do it. And companies, mine included, often do this as a differentiator. That we're better informed because we invested to get there. Second, I think data in and of itself doesn't necessarily solve problems. You need to have sort of a question that you can respond to, and not all of our problems in supply chain are data problems. And that's where I want to get to. You said responding to crises, and how do we do this in response to crises? I'll give you an example that many people are probably familiar with. Working your way through DC traffic. Is it better to have more information? Sure. Waze, something or whatever. I'm not going to make an endorsement here, Google Maps, whatever that's telling you traffic. If you know more, you're better. Does that mean that you can then zip home at 6 p.m., out to Fairfax or something and not have a concern? No, it doesn't. It may tell you, you may avoid the worst accident or you may do something. And I think that analogy applies pretty well in supply chains. That there is stuff we can do with information. This is worthwhile. There are some good initiatives. The Federal Maritime Commission is looking into this. The Department of Transportation has done some good stuff. But it has to be working towards operable stuff like which ports may be relatively open and have the right capabilities for ships that are setting sail at a given moment. Has to be done in timely fashion, and it has to maintain those incentives. It can happen, and there are real possibilities there.
So a step, but we need more to go along with it. We'll turn to you, Sarah. One of the three panels that are set up under the IPEF supply chain is the IPEF Supply Chain Council that seeks to build resilience and competitiveness in critical infrastructures. Clearly, chips is a critical infrastructure. America is building out more fabs to produce chips, but they're part of a very complex supply chain. How might this IPEF Supply Chain Council help in creating a more resilient network in the chip industry?
Yeah, no, I'm excited about this. And you're absolutely right. Chips is only one piece of a very complex, very intricate supply chain. You could look at critical minerals, for example, right? And what I'm excited about is having the council play a role in collaborating, diversifying, innovating, policy coordination so that we can build resistance. There's some stuff that's already happening. If you look at critical minerals, part of it is, can we map the critical minerals and the supply chain for it? And That's already been done to a certain extent, or is being done with Mexico, the US, and Canada under the Semiconductor Supply Chain Initiative. But it's also about promoting responsible mining. And, when we talk about critical minerals, it's not rare earths, it's rare processing, right? It's not just where these things are, it's processing them. So how do we encourage and incentivize responsible practices for both mining and processing? So how does the council play a role in that? Because we need long-term viability of these resources. So that's about diversifying sources. You don't want a choke point, right? You don't just want one geo. So what does that also mean? It means hopefully the council is going to look at investing in R&D and innovation, right? How do we do sustainable mining and sustainable processing? That's going to take R&D. Creating a strategic reserve. I mean, I think if we all saw what happens when you don't have strategic reserves from COVID, right? So that's an important piece of it. But what does that take? That takes, going back to data, you got to figure out, you got to anticipate, you got to have the data, you got to have, risk mitigation strategies. How do you do risk mitigation? There's a lot that's involved in that. And at the end of the day, it's about involving broadly the other member economies and countries and involving business, because you need that public-private partnership to not only come up with the technology solutions, but also the innovative financing solutions to solve these problems. So, and then at the end, 2 more points. I'm also hopeful that the council will play a role in advocacy and policy coordination. I think it's important that we have incentives, regulatory reforms, measures, again, to promote these practices and foster this sort of international collaboration, this block of 14 countries.
Lots of hopes for the council.
Lots of hopes.
That's good.
Go council.
And let's turn to Ryan. We've just seen China impose restrictions on gallium and germanium, posing risk to the supply chain. We know that there's multiple vulnerabilities in that critical mineral supply chain, but we also know that there's a lot of countries in the IPEF group that have sources for those. How can this council really work with those countries to help us mitigate the vulnerabilities that we have in the critical mineral supply chain?
Thanks, Mark. It's a great question. And, to Phil's point earlier, I'll be using Waze technology as I cruise home this afternoon to see my son finish his golf match. And Sarah, thanks for the sustainable and responsible mining points, because that's all part of it. But good question. Deepening geopolitical tensions are driving the world, not just the U.S., but China and the EU, Russia, and other countries to find more minerals and materials. And that's what the race is. That's what IPEF is all about. And if you look at this issue from the U.S. perspective, we have great allies in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, who are going to help us achieve that. Government policy over the last 60 years has been reactive. And if you look at the CHIPS and the Inflation Reduction Act, it sets up a status quo mentality. But other worlds are reacting to that. Look at what China is doing. They often mirror or attempt to follow what the rest of the industrial world is doing. They're already moving. So IPEF will be a good branch or good leveling of that practice.
Good. Phil, another panel that's created under the agreement is the tripartite IPEF Labor Rights Advisory Board that includes business, labor, and government representatives, and it's focused on how can they support promoting labor rights in supply chains. Elevating labor standards is a difficult ask of emerging markets, oftentimes only really granted if you give them something in return, like market access. We're looking for to have them step up without market access. What might they commit to as part of this tripartite board?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a noble goal to try and make sure that labor is treated well. But you have it exactly right. Our experience is, I'll just say on labor issues, this is not a novelty, thinking about labor and trade. At least back to when I probably started paying attention, somewhere in the 90s, you had, should labor be worked in one of the Singapore issues. And the challenge is that for a lot of developing countries, they perceive this as a means of stifling their comparative advantage. That maybe they have less skilled labor, which would then get lower wages. So they take this as something which they are giving up. And you tend to give up something in exchange for something. And so it's, you could you ask what could come out of this? What could one get? If there's not a, yes, you give this up, but here's the market access you get in return, what you probably get are principled statements at the kind of level that everybody can agree to. Labor should be treated well. There's things that we've all agreed to with the International Labor Organization, and we still agree to those, something there. If you want to push on towards sort of more actionable things, there's probably a price.
Well, the good news is that it'll shine the light on those issues and make them increased awareness within those countries, within America. And what we saw in USMCA, maybe I'll turn to you on this, Ryan, has shown that if you do incorporate enforcement of higher labor standards, that's a path to getting a broader congressional support for trade agreements. Is it reasonable to hold out hope that this board could help us lay the groundwork for future trade agreement, more traditional trade agreement?
Another good question, Mark. Yeah, so Rio Tinto, we're 90% unionized throughout North America. It's often that the building trades and the steel workers are with us at meetings on supply chain or setting standards. I believe that a high labor standard, Mark, is a good way to put a trade agreement together. Let's face it, if people want around the world, not only here in North America, they want good paying jobs. That means they put food on the table, they can pay for an education, they can buy that EV that's going to be built down the road. So I think it is a continued model of success that the U.S. should continue to pursue, enforcing high labor standards.
And we found that trade agreements can be a great avenue to do that,
That's
as
right.
we're seeing currently in Mexico as part of the new USMCA. Sarah, the third panel that's formed under the IPEF is the IPEF Supply Chain Crisis Response Network that seeks to have a mechanism to prevent and respond to emergencies. We're all familiar with the supply crunch in chips that impacted the auto industry and so many others. How could such a response network both help in predicting and avoiding, as well as responding to a similar crisis?
Yeah, no, I think we all know all too well from COVID. It was not autos, it was housing starts because you couldn't get the chip for the thermostat. It was the 10Ks that came out because of the Shanghai lockdown. Like, we all understand what it means when there's a supply chain disruption. But what if we could have an early warning system, right? The early warning system part of it is something that if we could have something to monitor, to sort of project the vulnerabilities, to identify the risks, and to have that communicated throughout the member countries and industries in advance, that means we can take proactive measures, right? You can do a different shipping lane, you can adjust and pivot. But what does that take? Phil's already talked about that. It takes sharing information, right? And coordinating that information. That means best practices, that means crisis response strategies, collaborative risk assessments. How do we look at risk? What is a risk? How do you define it? Developing contingency plans, right? I know, certainly all the companies are doing this right now, but how do you do that on a larger government or country level? Establishing those strategic reserves, right? So inevitably, whether it's Mother Nature, right? Whether it's a hot, hot summer, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's whatever it may be, we're going to need to be able to adjust to disruptions because we're not done with disruptions. I think you're banking the 10K of yours on that, right? Like, there's going to be a lot of need for third-party logistics suppliers. But we also need policy advocacy and diplomacy, right? You need to promote fair trade practices, resolve trade disputes. So that takes capacity building and training, right? Like, how are we going to build resistance among these member countries? How do you provide guidance? What is crisis management? How do you do tabletops with them? Again, it goes back to technology and technology coordination because these systems and these governments have to talk to each other. And it takes practice, exercises, right? So there's a lot that you can do under this rubric. And what would the world have looked like had we had this before COVID? It's an interesting question.
Well, we are certainly hopeful, and you laid out a strong agenda for it, that with it, that it'll be a better world looking forward. Ryan, there's also supply chains that can be caused by economic coercion, a concern that we've had more recently, such as when Japan was hit by China's ban on rare earth exports in 2010, or when Korea and others were hit by China's export restrictions on urea in 2021. How might this resilience supply chain crisis response network help in these types of situations?
Yeah, good question, Mark. So again, going back to geopolitical tensions, if one country operates and runs the world's supply of minerals and materials, that's going to set another crisis up. So what the countries are now looking at is how do we process more out of the extraction that we're getting from overseas or at home. That really is the center point going forward. Countries need to say, my supply chain for this widget requires this line. How do I secure it? How do I shorten it? And is it reliable? That's going to be the question over the next 10 and 20 years as we shift to more of a minerals and materials economy for climate change policy goals, for renewable energy, for EV infrastructure, et cetera. And let's not forget about just basic industrial policy and national defense. So all the countries for the last 20 years have gotten away with an easy, I'll get it there and it will show up on my doorstep tomorrow. Those days are gone. I think COVID showed us that secure, reliable, and trusted networks are essential going forward.
They certainly are. They're not going to get any less important going forward. You know, we haven't really had a comprehensive legal review of the supply chain, which is currently underway, so we don't know exactly what's in it, but we can talk about what we would hope would be in it. You know, export controls are highly disruptive to supply chain resilience, as we just mentioned. The U.S. application of such export controls and technology have to date been focused on addressing security concerns. But countries imposing export controls on energy or food may say that it's a domestic security issue for them. Could standards for when you use or how you use export controls be part of such a supply chain agreement? Phil, maybe you could answer that.
I think you can get something in there. I mean, you traditionally had trade agreements that were focused on sort of preventing import barriers, but you can, I think the key to a strong trading relationship, and I think we were just hearing this from Brian, is trust. That you do have people sort of trust that trade is specialization to a degree, that you say, I'm going to do this, you'll do that, and I know that I can get this from you, which is why I'm okay specializing in the stuff that I do. I think that requires these things to be, and so having a statement of principles that one says, we agree to that, we agree and we promise, and there may even be penalties, that stuff, I would say, tends to fit best in a more comprehensive agreement. Because often, I talked in response to an earlier one of your questions on, you know, how there's an incentive to get in and does one give something up. It's also worth noting that in general in the trading system, this is why people obeyed things. I mean, some of this is a sense of, you know, global citizenship and they want to behave nicely, but you also have a degree of enforcement. And I know that's a popular and rightly so thing to talk about in trade, which is enforcement. But often the enforcement was, if I made a promise to you and you made a promise to me, then what happens if I break mine? Well, then I know that you get to withdraw yours. And so the more substance there is in these things, the more confidence we can have in these commitments. Because, you know, the cautions is easy to say, yes, of course, I broadly subscribe to this, and then one gets to a crisis, and I agree that there will be more. And so you want to make sure that there's as good a supporting structure around that as you can do. So is there room for this in trade agreements? Yeah, there is room. And the stronger and more carefully constructed the agreement, the better that will work.
And Sarah, maybe not just export controls, but regulatory harmonization. You mentioned it earlier on in your remarks, how important that is to the efficiency as well as the resilience of supply chain. Tell us about what you might hope for in an agreement as it relates to those two issues.
Sure, and as I look out on the audience, I think everyone here is an expert on regulatory harmonization. I see a lot of experts in the audience, so you can come and tell me up later what I missed on the tick list. But I think we all agree that regulatory harmonization has a positive impact, right? It aligns standards, regulation, procedures. It reduces barriers, right? It makes things go faster, and time is money, right? So you increase efficiency, reduce costs, and improve risk management by common frameworks. So that at the end of the day, what do we all want? Predictability, right? Tell me what's going to happen, and then it happens. But as it relates to export controls, I think there is how do you get that multilateral agreements, right? How do you encourage countries to engage multilaterally or in a bloc? How do we have a risk-based approach on export controls, right? Assess potential risk and vulnerabilities to national security or economic stability before implementing those controls, ensuring that the restrictions are proportionate to the perceived threat. Advance notice whenever possible, right? Like, can we get advance notice to allow businesses and supply chain stakeholders to make adjustments and contingency plans to minimize that impact on operations? You know, and crucially important, I believe, is consultation and coordination. One, among the economies and members, right, and countries, but also with industry. Engaging in those dialogues on a country-to-country level, having each country understand the other's concerns, explore opportunities and alternatives, ensuring there's a dispute mechanism, right, so that you can have fair and impartial processes for resolving disputes whenever they arise to avoid escalation. And then I would say, you know, supportive policies, right? Again, going back to harmonization of standards, that's all about reducing trade barriers, fostering open, more resilient global trade. But those are some of the things I think about when I think about harmonization at large and harmonization, what can you do on export controls?
It's a full plate, and we certainly would hope that we would have that included in an agreement. You mentioned, Sarah, dispute resolutions. And again, we don't know what's in this agreement. It still hasn't been released as it's going through the legal scrubbing. And the approval process for this agreement is still not fully defined. But we don't know whether there's a dispute resolution as part of this. Phil, with your experience with trade agreements in the past, how important is that dispute resolution capability within an agreement? And how would you, if you don't have it in this non-traditional approach, we don't know if it's there or not, how would you make sure you would be addressing such disputes as they arise? Because clearly, we're going to make the agreements, nod our heads, say, yes, we all agree with that to begin with, but if you don't have a dispute resolution, it's going to make it a little bit harder.
Yeah, I think it's worth, dispute resolution in trade agreements is a little bit different than what we often think of in, say, like a domestic legal system. Because the domestic legal system, if you and I have a dispute over who owns some piece of property, we can take it to the court, it's all enforceable. In international agreements, you don't generally, it's not enforcement that way. There is no IPEF army or marshal service or something to enforce these things. So where it is really important, it tends to be as a verification mechanism. That if there's a factual question, wait, did I or did I not commit to giving you this thing? And did I then execute on that commitment? It helps to have some kind of impartial mechanism where somebody can say, this is how we see the facts. But to then go beyond that and say, all right, well, if they decide I'm in the wrong and you're in the right, can they make me comply? That's another level. We shouldn't overtax those. So it's important as verification. To get the sort of actual enforcement, you need to have more, which is that people have to have the incentives to say, and I actually want to be seen as an actor who's behaving well. That there's enough in this agreement that being a part of it, being in good standing, have the kind of trade-offs we talked about, that those are the kind of things that, all right, fine, I give in, you win. But that's what you needed. But the verification stuff is very important.
It is, and as we consider this agreement, IPEF, and think about the countries that are in it, you not only have our very long-standing traditional high advanced economies like Japan, South Korea, Australia, but you also have, many of the emerging markets in there. And if you think about the economic vibrancy of this region, this is where much of the growth is happening. What do the panelists have thoughts in terms of just how important this area, this region is to us? Anybody want to, in terms of your own companies, in terms of your industry?
Go ahead,
I'm
Sarah.
just going to start with, let's start with India, and it's the most populous country on this planet. So how important is this group of countries? Incredibly important. If you look at GDP, if you look at population, if you look at consumer markets, where is the growth coming from? It's incredibly important. And then from my industry, for semiconductors, if you look at supply chains and manufacturing and inputs, it's all much of it is there. And we're trying to rebalance it, but much of it is currently there.
A big region.
I agree. Look, the region is only growing, and there are known minerals and materials there. Manufacturing know-how is there. there are aligned countries who are in the same belief that they want a skilled workforce, they want to move product that they produce there, et cetera. So this region will continue to be hugely important for the next decades to come.
Extremely important for supply chains, both because of the population, economic vibrancy, but also because they've perfected, in many cases, how do you deliver things in the way that that consumers around the world want.
And as we think about places where we want to have more resiliency in our supply chains, more diversity within our supply chains, many of opportunities in this region to help build that resilience, that diversity. So supply chains are important. This region is vitally important to the United States, and this panel has done a wonderful job in helping to dissect what this new supply chain agreement under IPEF might be. So please give our audience, please give our panel a round of applause.
We should give the audience a round.
Thanks, Mark.
And the audience a round of applause as well. So thank you. Again, thanks for being with our panel. We'll be awaiting our next panel coming up here in just a minute.
Thank you.